My task today is to say a few words about John chapter 9 as we continue to work our way through the book of John. It's the famous story of Jesus' healing of the blind man. So I'm going to start out with a few introductory comments, but spend most of my time actually looking at the text. I am one of those people who is persuaded that John chapter 9 is the single most central story in the whole Gospel of John. Now, part of that depends on kind of how you read the background of John, and I'm sure all of the teachers might probably read it in a slightly different way. So I'll kind of tell you where I'm coming from in my comments, and then you can make your own decisions. Most people who study John date it towards the end of the first century. So I'm just going to pick a year, 85. And it could have been a few years earlier than that. It couldn't be much later. So when you think about a book that's written in 85, John is basically a second generation document. John was the only gospel written to people like us. That is, people who are having to make decisions about Jesus without having been eyewitnesses to the events. So, John is the gospel that most straightforwardly tells us why he was writing. In John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, he says, I've written these things that you might believe. Now, here's the point I want to emphasize. When John says, I've written these things that you might believe, he's not talking to non-Christians, he's talking to Christians. John is a book about trying to get Christians who did not see the events of Jesus himself to believe. He's trying to get Christians to believe. Okay, so let's say we're in the year 85 or so. It is becoming clearer and clearer that Christians are not some odd sort of Jew, but are something else entirely. I think there was a time when it looked like another, kind of Jewish subset. You have Pharisee Jews, and you have Sadducee Jews, and you have Essene Jews, and you have Christian Jews. But by 85, the tensions between Jews and Christians are becoming more substantial. And in fact, that Christians are probably getting kicked out of the synagogues. They're starting to have to pay some sort of social price for the fact that they've become Christians. And if you were a Jewish unbeliever in 85, you know the sort of things that you would say to Christians. You'd say, are you really going to believe in a Messiah that was killed by the Romans on a cross? Is that really what the power of God looks like? So much of John's gospel is written to show that Jesus was not a hapless victim, that in fact he's in control of everything along the way, and he is encouraging Christians to not abandon their faith in Jesus when they're starting to have to pay some price for it. Now, I want you to hold in the back of your mind that Christians might be getting kicked out of the synagogues. One of the interesting things about John is that often characters that look a little bit like they're on the periphery actually might have an important role to play in the story. And I know this is going to sound a little bit kooky at the beginning, but I'm going to argue that this story is largely about the parents. And when we get to that part, we'll look at it. Okay, so a few comments about the beginning of John chapter 9, the beginning of the text. I'm going to read a few verses. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now, scholars refer to this as Deuteronomic theology. obviously comes from the book of Deuteronomy, and the book of Deuteronomy often says that if you are obedient to God, if you're a good covenant people, He will bless you, and if you're disobedient to God, you will be cursed or afflicted. And so it became kind of common to think that a person's physical well being told you something about their spiritual life. If they were sick, if they were poor, that means that God was afflicting them. If they were wealthy and healthy, that means God's blessing is on them. So when they see this man who has been born blind, they have no question that sin is involved. Their only question is who's responsible for the sin? Since he was born blind, is the man being punished for his own sins, or is he being punished for the sins of his parents? Now, as you probably know, in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Job is written largely to sort of wrestle with this problem of Deuteronomic theology. How do we make sense of certain kinds of suffering in the world that don't seem to be tied up to a person's goodness or badness? And in this particular case, Jesus dismisses their appeal to Deuteronomic theology. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. And so Jesus gives us, in some ways, a more troubling answer, and he says, "Okay, this is came about so that the power of God can be displayed." And when Jesus talks about that, he's always talking about himself. At any rate, we know he dismisses the Deuteronomic theology and sees this as the occasion for the showing of the glory of who Jesus is. Now, I need to pause one more time before we read the rest of the text. There are very few miracles in John. There are 7 really in the first 11 chapters, and then there's 1 right at the end. And the question in John is, will a miracle be a sign? And the difference in a miracle and a sign is a miracle is some wondrous work, but a sign points to Jesus and his true identity. And some people see the miracle, but they don't see the sign. And in this story, we're going to see everybody sees the miracle, but not everybody sees the sign. Same way today, right? Some people just can't get enough evidence as to who Jesus is. In verse 6, he starts the actual healing. Having said this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, it looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I'm the man." "How then were your eyes open?" they demanded. He replied, "The man they called Jesus made some mud, put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash, so I went and washed, and then I could see." "Where is this man?" they asked him. "I don't know," he said. That's one of the few sort of amusing things here. They ask him where Jesus is, but the last time he saw Jesus, he couldn't see, so he doesn't really know. They brought him to the Pharisees, the man who had been blind. Now, the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore, the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. We always had this continuing conversation going on about Sabbath. One of the convictions of certain Jews of the time was if every Jew ever kept Sabbath perfectly one time, then the day of the Lord would come. So when Jesus does things that they see as a violation of Sabbath, that's why it's such a big deal to them, that rather than being the coming of the day of the Lord, his actions are preventing it from coming. Therefore, the Pharisees also asked him how he'd received his sight. "He put mud on my eyes," the man replied, "and I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others asked, "How can a sinner do such miraculous signs?" So they were divided. Finally, they turned again to the blind man. "What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened." The man replied, "He's a prophet." The Jews still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. "Is this your son?" they asked. "Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see?" "We know he is our son," the parents answered. "We know he was born blind, but how he can see now or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for already the Jews had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Christ would be put out of the synagogue. That was why his parents said, "He is of age. Ask him." And in some ways, this is the guts of the story. Um, I think that it's kind of hard to overestimate just how bad the parents look in this story. Imagine that you have a son, he's been blind from birth, and all of a sudden he can see again. And you're called to account for that, and they don't stand up for him at all. And John tells us the reason is they're afraid if they do, they'll get kicked out of the synagogue. And all we can think about is how weak, how groveling is that. Now, remember, John is writing his gospel to Christians who are starting to get kicked out of the synagogues. And that's why I think this story is so central. He wants to show them how ridiculous it is to abandon faith in Jesus Christ because you're afraid you'll get kicked out of the synagogue. He's trying to tell the people who are receiving his writings that, okay, look how bad these parents look. Is that really who you want to be? Are you really going to abandon faith in the one who can make a man who is born blind see? Are you going to abandon that because you're afraid you're going to get kicked out of the synagogues? Okay, that's why this story is so central. So the parents, unwilling to take a stand, kick it back to the man. Verse 24, a second time they summoned the man who had been blind. "Give glory to God," they said. "We know this man is a sinner." He replied, "Whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know. I was blind, but now I see." Then they asked him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered, "I told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too?" And I'm getting to the point where I increasingly like this guy. He says, "I keep trying to tell you, you don't listen. Maybe you're keep asking because you're wanting to become his disciples." They ask him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" "I told you already. You did not listen. You want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too?" Then they hurled insults at him and said, "You are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from." The man answered, "Now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly man who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." To this they replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out. Well, okay, there's some interesting kind of theological stuff going on here that we don't need to get too troubled by. You have this statement about we know God doesn't hear sinners, and we wonder, okay, what does that say about me then? Because I try to pray and I'm a sinner. But what the man's really saying is this guy called on the power of God to heal me, and it happened, and you're saying that he's a sinner. That doesn't make any sense. He appears to have a very special relationship with God. We also see in this passage that the Jewish leaders are insisting in checking out Jesus' pedigree. Where did he go to prophet school? Who are his teachers? Um, and the Bible is always in conversation with itself. This reminds me of what goes on in the book of Amos in the Hebrew Bible. You may remember that Amos is being given a hard time by the priest and the king for his preaching, and Amos' response was, "I'm not a prophet. I'm not the son of a prophet. That is, I wasn't a professional prophet. I didn't go to prophet school. God just gave me a message, and here's the message." And they don't think Jesus could possibly be a person from God because they don't know where he went to school and they don't know what his background is, and he's not from their tribe. Um, but what's interesting here is they finally get so frustrated as they just kick the guy out of the synagogue. You're steeped at birth. Since you were born blind, you must be a sinner. And they can't allow their theology to be disrupted by the event that's right in front of them. They can't deny the event, and their questions look sillier and sillier. And I do like our friend who is born blind and healed. We isn't even given a name in this particular text because he says, "Okay, I'm not sure about all that theology stuff. There's the one thing I know. I was blind, and now I see." Um, One of the things that's sort of amusing when you're trained in a theology school like I am, and you preach your sermons and you try to do justice to the historical background and to the original text and the context, and you're studious about trying to do your work. And then you're going to go on vacation, and you have to leave the preaching to a lay person, and they don't know how to read Greek, and they don't have any commentaries, and they don't know how to do the kind of work you do, and so they do the one thing they know how to do. They get up and say, "Yeah, I don't know about all the theology stuff, but this is what I know. I was blind, and now I see." And then you come back from your vacation, and everybody is so uh, glorious in their report about your substitute because there's something about the appeal of that message. Okay, I'm not sure I can sort all the theology out, but I do know this: I was blind, and now I see. And I do think that at least raises the question for us about what do we know about Jesus through experience. We know a lot through study. We know a lot through research, but how is our testimony based in our experience of Jesus Christ? I'll remind you, for those who don't know this, that the word faith, the noun faith, never occurs in the book of John. It always occurs in the verb form. Faith is not something you have. Faith is something you do. Faith is the experience of trusting God. Trusting God when your brother dies. Trusting God when you run out of wine. Trusting God when you're blind and can't see. It's the experience of trusting God that constitutes faith in the book of John. So it's probably worth some reflection to sort of think about. Okay, what do I know about God that is real in my own experience in my own life of trust? One final thing to reflect on in this passage. One of the reasons why this passage is so crucial to the book of John is John is very preoccupied with the question of seeing and believing. Now, remember, again, he's writing to people who didn't see the events that they're being asked to believe in, just like you, who didn't see Jesus walking around or raised from the dead. So, what's the relationship between seeing and believing? You may remember that John will say later, in the context of Jesus talking to Thomas, blessed are you who have seen and believed. You know, that scene where he puts his hand in Jesus' wounds. But he said, even more blessed are those who haven't seen but believe, which is the people that John's writing to. And this is actually kind of a complicated problem. And, you have this interesting thing going on here where immediately after this event, Jesus talks about spiritual blindness. Verse 35, Jesus heard that they'd thrown him out, and when he found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Who is he, sir? The man asked. Tell me so that I may believe in him. You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you. Then the man said, Lord, I believe, and he worshiped him. It's one of the great moments in the Bible. Jesus said, for judgment I have come into this world so that the blind will see and those who see will become blind. Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this and asked, what are we blind to? Jesus said, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin, but now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains. Okay, it's kind of complicated stuff. But the occasion of healing this man's sight does lead Jesus to reflect on seeing and believing. And in John, the miracles are crucial to grounding faith. These are miracles, but the question is, do they become signs? And I would argue, along with others, that for John, for faith to become truly mature, it has to move beyond the seeing phase. The people to whom John is writing are those who didn't see the events. And I do think there's a little warning here of those of us who have to constantly move from one miracle of God in the world to the next. We kind of live for the next great thing that God does. And the kind of question that's put to us is, okay, can you grow beyond that? Can you get to the point where it's not just the next big thing, that your faith is so mature, your faith is so secure that even though you can't get there without the testimony of the miracles, you could go through long swaths of your life where you don't have one of those spectacular events. Everybody knows the story of Mother Teresa by now, who very early had kind of one of these appearances of God to her and then didn't have another one for the rest of their lives. I've spent a lot of time out in the desert with hermits and monks, and people always want to know what that's like. And I'll tell you, a lot of it is drudgery, and it's boredom. And one of the things you have to give up is the desire to have that next great thing happen. You have to have a faith that is so deep that it's not dependent on that next spectacular thing. Seeing, yes, it's important, but believing's got to be based more deeply than just seeing the next event. As we see from the Jewish leader here, it's possible to see the miracle and not see the sign. They see the miracle, but they don't see the truth connected with Jesus. And in the end, the miracle is secondary. It's the identity of Jesus that's crucial in John. The one sent by God, the Messiah, the one who isn't killed because he can't stop it, but the one who chooses to die. The one who is worth getting kicked out of the synagogues in order to follow. I think that's the message of this little passage, and a pretty good message for us today.